My name is Kira Moore, and at 29 years old, I'm a major in the United States Marine Corps. But at my own sister's wedding, I was nothing. My father, Frank, said it loud enough for the whole table to hear, jerking his chin in my direction. That one's just a glorified janitor. Who even invited her? Laughter erupted, relieved, eager, and cruel. My mother just gave a tiny shake of her head, a silent signal to not make a scene. My sister, the bride, quickly turned away. Not a single person reached out. They didn't know I had sent a text just minutes before, a text that would change everything. And then, the groom's father rose from the head table. The room seemed to warp. Forks stopped mid-air. He snapped a salute, a gesture as sharp and final as a flag breaking in the wind. "Sir, with all due respect," his voice boomed, "she outranks every last one of us in here. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by your own family, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button. And get ready for the day the silence was finally broken." The wedding reception was held at the Carrie Blast Furnaces, a National Historic Landmark just outside of Pittsburgh. It was a place built to celebrate ghosts, the ghosts of industry, of American steel, of men like my father. Towering rust-colored furnaces, silent for decades, loomed over the reception tent like skeletal gods of a forgotten religion. My father loved it. To him, this was a cathedral of real work, of sweat and grit. To me, it felt like a graveyard. Inside the tent, they had tried to soften the industrial decay with strings of fairy lights draped between massive steel I-beams. The effect was unsettling, like putting a lace doily on a battleship. A thick, humid Pennsylvania air hung in the tent, carrying a strange mix of scents. The sweet, smoky aroma of pulled pork and barbecue sauce from the buffet line, the vinegary tang of potato salad, the earthy smell of cornbread, all layered over the damp metallic odor of old, cold steel. It was the smell of a world I had escaped, a world I no longer fit into. I felt like a misplaced machine part precisely engineered for a function that didn't exist here. I found my assigned table in a corner, a sort of no man's land between the main family tables and the distant cousins. From my vantage point, I could see everything. I watched my father, Frank, holding court near the bar. He had a bottle of Iron City beer in his thick, calloused hand, the label peeling slightly from the condensation. He was in his element, surrounded by his brothers and a few of his construction buddies, roaring with laughter at a crude joke I was glad I couldn't hear. He looked completely at ease, a king in his castle of rust and iron. And as his eyes scanned the room, they eventually found me. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just held my gaze for a moment, a flicker of something cold and calculating in his expression. I knew, with the certainty of a soldier who knows the sound of an incoming round, that I was his next target. He didn't wait long. After another swig of beer, he ambled over to our table, not to greet me, but to perform. He leaned down, placing his hands on the back of my cousin Anthony's chair, pointedly ignoring me, though I was sitting right next to him. He was putting on a show for the table, for my aunts, my uncles, the people who had watched me grow up. He jerked his chin in my direction, a gesture of pure contempt. "That one," he began, his voice a low rumble meant to carry, "is just a glorified janitor." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, a smug, self-satisfied smile spreading across his face. "Who even invited her?" The words hit me with physical force. It wasn't just the insult, as crude and ignorant as it was. It was the public declaration. He wasn't just demeaning my career as a logistics officer in the Marine Corps. He was revoking my very right to be there, at my own sister's wedding. He was telling the world I was an embarrassment, a piece of filth that should have been swept under the rug. For a split second, the air left my lungs. The cheerful music, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a dull, roaring hum in my ears. The shock was a cold wave washing over me, threatening to pull me under. But the deepest cut didn't come from Frank. It came in the 3 seconds that followed. First, the laughter. It started with my great-aunt Carol, a sharp cackling sound that broke the stunned silence. It was a laugh of permission, signaling to everyone else that it was okay, that the target had been officially marked. Others joined in, a ripple of nervous, then eager chuckles. It was the sound of a pack turning on its own. Second, my mother. I risked a glance at her, seated at the next table over. Brenda Moore didn't look at me. She was staring at her plate, but I saw her give the tiniest, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was a gesture I knew intimately. It wasn't a defense of me. It was a plea. A silent, desperate message that screamed, "Don't you dare make a scene, Kira. Just take it. Just let it go for the sake of peace." Her peace built on the foundation of my silence. And finally, my sister, Lacey. The bride, radiant in a white dress that probably cost more than my first car. I saw her out of the corner of my eye. She heard it. I know she did. But she didn't turn. She didn't defend me. She just shifted her weight, the silk of her gown rustling, and angled her body slightly away, pretending to be absorbed in a conversation with her new mother-in-law. Her avoidance was the final nail in the coffin. Their collective silence wasn't just silence. It was a verdict. It was a roaring, unanimous confirmation of my father's words. Yes, he's right. You do not belong here. I didn't answer. I didn't cry. I didn't even move. My training, the brutal, relentless discipline hammered into my soul at Quantico, took over. My body went into lockdown. I focused on a single, controllable action. My breathing. In through the nose for a 4 count. Hold. Out through the mouth for a 4 count. It was a technique we used to lower our heart rate under fire, to stay calm when the world was exploding around us. I narrowed my field of vision, shrinking the cavernous, hostile room until the only thing in my universe was the oak table in front of me. I studied the deep grain of the wood, tracing the lines with my eyes, focusing on its solid, unfeeling reality. The laughter, the whispers, my mother's cowardice. It all became distant noise outside the perimeter of my control. Then, through the tabletop, I felt a subtle vibration. It was the distinct scrape of a chair leg on the concrete floor, followed by the shift of a large man standing up. I didn't have to look up. I knew who it was. The text message I'd sent to General Peterson a few minutes earlier had been a simple courtesy. A subordinate officer informing a senior one of her arrival. "General, sir, just letting you know I've arrived." I never expected a response. But in that moment, as I felt his presence shift the gravity of the entire room, I realized that simple text had just become my distress signal. That feeling at the wedding, the cold, crushing weight of being erased by my own family. It wasn't new. It was just a public performance of a private play they'd been rehearsing for my entire life. My tactical breathing in that reception hall was a skill I'd learned in the Marines, but the war itself started long before that. It started in a small shared bedroom in a blue-collar suburb of Pittsburgh. That room was a perfect map of the family's unspoken constitution. It was divided by an invisible line down the middle, 2 separate worlds under one roof. Lacey's side was a pink explosion. A chaotic, joyful mess of Barbie dolls with tangled hair, glitter, half-finished craft projects, and silk ribbons spilling out of drawers. It was everything a little girl's world was supposed to be. My side was different. It was a world of order. I had model airplanes, an A-10 Warthog, a C-130 Hercules, hanging from the ceiling on fishing line, perfectly spaced. My books were arranged by subject. My desk was clear except for the project I was working on. And my wall was covered with weather charts I'd carefully copied from the newspaper. My father, Frank, would often stand in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. He'd look at Lacey's side, and a genuine smile would soften his face. "Now this," he'd say with a proud chuckle. "This is a little girl's room." Then his eyes would drift across the invisible line to my side. The smile would vanish. A heavy sigh would escape his lips, the kind of sigh you make when you're looking at a tax form you don't understand. "And this," he'd mutter, more to himself than to me. "This looks like the damn IRS office." He wasn't just commenting on our decorating choices. He was passing judgment on our very nature. Lacey was a delight. I was a problem to be solved. That feeling crystallized in the 8th grade. I'd always been drawn to systems, to understanding how things worked, or more often, how they broke. For the school science fair, I poured everything I had into a project on emergency evacuation logistics for our town. It wasn't a baking soda volcano. It was a detailed, multi-page analysis with flowcharts, population density maps, and calculated response times. I won first place. I remember the weight of the blue ribbon in my hand, the surge of pride so intense it almost made me dizzy. I couldn't wait for my parents to see it during the open house that evening. My mother came, told me it was very smart, dear, and then drifted off to chat with another parent. But I was waiting for Frank. When he finally arrived, smelling faintly of sawdust and beer, he walked right up to my display. I held my breath. He squinted at the complex charts, his brow furrowed. He didn't say a word to me. Instead, he turned to my science teacher, Mr. Davies, who was standing nearby. With a dismissive wave at my project, Frank said, "My kid's got some odd hobbies. At least it keeps her busy." He never once looked me in the eye. He never asked a single question. In front of the one teacher who saw my potential, my own father had reduced my greatest achievement into a quirky, time-wasting habit. The pride I felt curdled into a hot, sharp shame that burned in my stomach. The final lesson came the year I turned 16. For Lacey's 16th birthday, my parents bought her a used but reliable Toyota Corolla. There was a cake, balloons, the whole celebration. She was the baby. She needed to be taken care of. Later that year, I was selected for a week-long academic program in Washington, D.C., a huge opportunity. I just needed to cover the fee for the bus and lodging. I had some money saved from my part-time job bagging groceries, but I was short about $200. I asked Frank if he could help. He sat me down at the kitchen table and gave me a look that was supposed to pass for fatherly wisdom. "Kira, you're the oldest. You have to be self-reliant," he said, his voice firm. "Lacey is the baby. She needs looking after." Besides, he added, delivering the final blow, "I know you have that savings account. Figure it out." It was the first time I understood the cruel irony of my role in the family. My responsibility wasn't a virtue to be rewarded, it was a weapon to be used against me. Lacey's carelessness was a reason for her to be coddled. My diligence was a reason for me to be abandoned. I used my savings, and I went on the trip. But I never asked him for anything again. The public library became my refuge. It was a place where the rules were clear and the system worked. I wasn't reading for school, I was reading to understand. I found a book about the 1991 perfect storm, the real-life disaster. I became obsessed, not with the giant waves or the sinking ships, but with the chain of failures that led to the tragedy. The broken weather fax machine, the flawed forecasts, the series of human decisions made under pressure. I didn't see a storm, I saw a catastrophic systems failure. I realized then that I didn't want to ride the wave. I wanted to be the person who saw the whole map, the person who could prevent the disaster before it ever happened. If you've ever felt like the responsible one in your family, and that responsibility was used against you instead of being appreciated, please support this story with a like, and just comment with a simple, "I see you" below, so I know I'm not alone. One Tuesday afternoon, a Marine Corps recruiter set up a table in our high school cafeteria. He was a gunnery sergeant, sharp and squared away. He wasn't talking about glory or blowing things up. He was talking about challenges, about structure. He pointed to a line on his poster, a phrase I had never heard before. He said, "People think wars are won with guns. They're not. Logistics wins wars." Logistics. The word hit me like a lightning strike. It was the language I'd been speaking my entire life without knowing its name. It was the science of moving people and equipment, of seeing the big picture, of making a complex system work under impossible pressure. It was my science fair project, my weather charts, my obsession with preventing failure. In the middle of that noisy cafeteria, looking at a simple fold-out table and a poster, I finally saw it. It wasn't just an escape, it was a destination. That recruiter's poster wasn't just a promise, it was a portal. Stepping through it led me directly to the gates of Officer Candidate School in Quantico, Virginia. And stepping through those gates led me directly to hell. Or at least, hell's sweltering front porch. The Virginia heat in summer is a living thing. It's a thick, wet blanket of humidity that clings to your skin, fills your lungs, and refuses to let go, day or night. That heat was the constant backdrop to the primary feature of OCS, the screaming. From the moment we stepped off the bus, the world became a relentless chorus of drill instructors' voices, raw and guttural, designed to break you down to your component parts so they could rebuild you as a Marine officer. We ran until our lungs burned. We low-crawled through mud and gravel until our elbows and knees were raw meat. We navigated obstacle courses that seemed designed by a sadist, pushing our bodies to a breaking point and then demanding more. I was never the fastest runner. I wasn't the strongest on the pull-up bar. But what I discovered in that crucible was that I was durable. While other candidates, bigger and stronger than me, were collapsing from heat exhaustion or quitting from sheer mental fatigue, I just kept going. I learned to shut down the part of my brain that felt pain or exhaustion and focus on one thing and one thing only, the immediate task in front of me. Get over this wall. Get to that ridge. Clean this rifle. My entire world shrank to the next objective. It was the loneliest I'd ever been in my life. The isolation was absolute. But it was a clean kind of loneliness, different from the suffocating invisibility I felt at home. Here, no one cared where you came from, who your father was, or what your sister was doing. The system was brutal, but it was fair. The only question that mattered was, can you complete the mission? For the first time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. About halfway through the 10-week course, during a rare moment of quiet after evening chow, they held mail call. A stack of letters from the outside world, a lifeline for most candidates. I never expected anything, so I was surprised when the sergeant yelled, "More!" My heart gave an unfamiliar lurch. It was a letter from my mother. I took it back to my rack, my hands trembling slightly as I tore open the envelope. Inside was a glossy 4x6 photo of Lacey. She was smiling, her teeth impossibly white, wearing a shimmering blue dress. It was her prom picture. My mother's neat, cursive handwriting filled the single page. "Hi, honey," it began. "Everything is fine here at home. Your father just finished reshingling the back porch. Your sister Lacey is always so busy with her friends, you know how it is. I hope you're eating enough out there." That was it. Not a single question about how I was doing. Not one word of encouragement. No acknowledgement of the grueling ordeal I was putting myself through. It was a weather report from a planet I no longer inhabited. As I folded the letter, a final sentence, scrawled at the bottom in my father's blocky, aggressive handwriting, caught my eye. "Hope they're teaching you how to mop a floor right." I stared at the words, the ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper. There was no anger, no sadness, just a profound, chilling clarity. This letter wasn't a failed attempt at connection, it was a reminder of my designated place in their world. It was a message from my jailers, checking in to make sure I remembered my sentence. I carefully tore the letter and the photograph into 4 neat squares and dropped them in the trash. They weren't fuel for my anger. They were dead weight, and I was traveling light. A week later, we had our final land navigation test. We were dropped in the middle of a dense forest at night, given a map, a compass, and a series of coordinates. The mission: lead your fire team to all 5 points and get to the extraction zone by 0500. The candidate in charge of the team next to mine was a former college football player, a huge guy who approached every problem with brute force. I watched his team crash into the woods, trying to take the most direct route, a straight line through the thickest, most unforgiving terrain. I did the opposite. I gathered my team, spread the map on the ground under the red light of my headlamp, and took a full 5 minutes to study the terrain. I saw a deep gully the other team was heading straight for. I saw a winding creek bed that represented a longer route, maybe a half-mile longer. But it was a clear, established path around the worst of the terrain. A quote from General James Mattis, a Marine I'd started reading about, echoed in my head. "The most important 6 inches on the battlefield is between your ears." We weren't going to fight the terrain. We were going to use our heads and let the terrain work for us. We took the long way. We moved at a steady, quiet pace, confirming our position at every checkpoint. 2 hours later, we arrived at the extraction point, tired but composed. We were the first team back. 30 minutes later, the football players' team stumbled out of the woods, scratched up, covered in mud, and missing one of their waypoints. They had failed. The next morning, my drill instructor, a formidable gunnery sergeant with a chest full of ribbons and a face that looked like it was carved from granite, pulled me aside after formation. I braced myself for a verbal assault. He just stood there for a moment, looking me up and down, his eyes unblinking. He didn't praise me. He didn't smile. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "More," he said, his voice a low growl. "You don't think like a candidate. You think like a logistics officer. Keep doing that." He turned and walked away. My whole body felt light. It was maybe a dozen words. But in those dozen words, I felt something I had never felt from my own father. Recognition. He saw me. He saw my specific strength and gave it a name. That acknowledgement was worth more than any medal. It was the first brick laid in the foundation of a new woman, a woman whose value would be defined not by the family she was born into, but by the missions she could complete. The gunnery sergeant's words at Quantico weren't just a dismissal, they were a commission. They propelled me forward across the graduation stage and straight into my first duty station as a newly minted second lieutenant at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. It was there, in the sprawling, sandy landscape of the Marine Corps' East Coast hub, that I met the man who would teach me the true meaning of family. His name was Gunnery Sergeant Miller, though everyone just called him Gunny. He was a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man with 2 decades in the Corps and a calm, steady presence that seemed to absorb the chaos around him. When I, a fresh-faced officer barely old enough to rent a car, was assigned to his logistics unit, his expression was professionally neutral, but I could read the skepticism in his eyes. I was another butter bar lieutenant, full of textbook knowledge and zero real-world experience, and it was his job to make sure I didn't get anyone killed. My first major task was to overhaul the supply warehouse, a chaotic labyrinth of mismatched shelves, uncatalogued gear, and frustrated junior Marines. The officer I was replacing had apparently tried to fix it by yelling. I decided on a different approach. For the first week, I didn't issue a single order. I just walked the floor with a notepad, a pen, and my mouth shut. I watched the workflow. I asked the Lance Corporals and PFCs, the ones actually doing the work, what their biggest frustrations were. I learned their names. I mapped out the entire process from receiving to deployment on a giant whiteboard in my tiny office. The whole time, I was aware of Gunny Miller, observing me from a distance, never interfering, his face giving nothing away. About a month in, we had a crisis. A pallet of high-frequency communication radios, critical for an upcoming deployment, had vanished into the black hole of our own system. It was logged as received, but couldn't be located. Panic started to ripple through the command. My superior officer, a captain, was turning red in the face, barking at everyone to find the damn radios now. While others scurried around in a state of controlled chaos, I closed my office door. I took a deep breath, pulled up the new inventory tracking system I'd been quietly building based on my observations, and got to work. My system wasn't about yelling louder. It was about listening to the data. By cross-referencing the receiving dock's logs with the forklift operator's daily movement reports, I narrowed the pallet's location down to one of 3 massive, mislabeled aisles. It took me less than 2 hours to find them, tucked away behind a shipment of winter gear that had been delivered 6 months early. Later that afternoon, Gunny Miller appeared at my office door. He didn't knock, just filled the frame. In his hand was a simple, steaming styrofoam cup of coffee. He walked in, placed it on the corner of my cluttered desk, and looked at me directly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, respectful baritone. "I've worked for a lot of officers. Most of them just yell louder when things go wrong. You're the first one I've seen who knows how to listen to the problem." He gave a small nod. "It's good to be working with you." The gesture, the simple cup of coffee, and the quiet words of acknowledgement felt more significant than any medal I could have earned. It was respect, pure and simple, given for a job well done. As the fall settled in and the North Carolina air turned crisp, Thanksgiving approached. It was my first major holiday away from home, and I had no plans other than catching up on work. Gunny must have known. He found me in the motor pool one afternoon, looking over a maintenance report. "Lieutenant," he said casually, "you got plans for Thanksgiving?" "Not really, Gunny, just sticking around the base." He nodded, as if expecting that answer. "Well, my house always has an extra seat. My wife makes the best sweet potato casserole you'll ever taste." The invitation was so simple, so direct, it caught me off guard. There was no pity in his voice, just a matter-of-fact offer. I hesitated for only a moment before the loneliness of my empty barracks room flashed in my mind. "I'd like that very much, Gunny. Thank you." That Thursday, I drove to a modest, tidy house in a suburban neighborhood just outside of Jacksonville. The moment I stepped out of my car, I was hit by a wave of incredible smells. Roasting turkey, the sweet spice of cinnamon and pumpkin, the savory scent of baking bread. When Gunny opened the door, the warmth and the sound of laughter and children playing washed over me. "Kira, glad you could make it. Come on in," he said, taking my coat. He didn't call me ma'am or lieutenant. Just Kira. He introduced me to his wife Sarah, a woman with a warm, genuine smile, and to their kids and a handful of other guests, fellow Marines and their families. No one asked about my rank or my job. They asked where I was from, what music I liked, if I'd tried the cranberry sauce yet. Sarah led me into the kitchen, a bustling hub of controlled chaos. "I could use an extra pair of hands on these potatoes if you don't mind," she said, handing me a peeler. And so I stood there, leaning against the counter in a stranger's kitchen, peeling potatoes next to a woman I'd just met, the sound of an NFL game humming from the TV in the living room. And I felt a sense of peace so profound it almost made my knees weak. I felt home. Later that evening, as the party wound down, I was helping Gunny clear plates from the dining room table. "I hope you had a good time, Lieutenant," he said, stacking the plates. "I had a great time, Gunny. Thank you so much for inviting me. Your family's wonderful." He stopped what he was doing and looked at me, his expression serious but kind. "In the Corps," he said quietly, "we take care of our own. It's not in the regulations. It's just who we are." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You're part of this family, Lieutenant." And with that one sentence, the carefully constructed defensive wall I had spent a lifetime building around my heart just crumbled. It wasn't a violent explosion, but a quiet, complete disintegration. That night, back in my silent barracks room, I cried for the first time in years. They weren't tears of pain or loneliness. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. I had finally found a place where I belonged. The years after that first Thanksgiving with the Millers were the most peaceful of my life. I earned my promotion to captain, and my time at Camp Lejeune was filled with purpose. Gunny Miller remained my mentor, and his family became my anchor. They were my holidays, my weekend barbecues, my emergency contacts. For the first time, I understood what it felt like to have a safe harbor. My communication with my own family dwindled to superficial birthday texts and an awkward Christmas card exchange. The distance felt healthy, like a necessary quarantine. Then came the assignment I'd been working towards, a post in Okinawa, Japan. The physical distance, nearly 7,000 miles and a 13-hour time difference, felt like the final brick in the wall I'd so carefully built. Here, I was truly on my own, and I thrived on the responsibility. My life was orderly, disciplined, and calm. The ghosts of Pittsburgh felt a million miles away. But ghosts, I would learn, are excellent swimmers. The attack came at 3 o'clock in the morning. The ring of my phone on the nightstand was a shrill, invasive sound that ripped me from a deep sleep. A call at this hour, on a secure military base halfway across the world, could only mean one of two things: a critical incident on base or a death in the family. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled for the phone, my eyes struggling to focus on the caller ID. It was my mother. "Hello," I said, my voice thick with sleep. "Kira, honey, thank God." Her voice was a high-pitched, frantic whisper. "Oh, honey, something terrible has happened." This was the opening salvo, a tactic as old as our family itself, the immediate creation of a crisis with my mother as the panicked messenger. "Mom, what is it? What's wrong?" She launched into a long, rambling story, full of sighs and dramatic pauses. It was about Lacey. My little sister, who had always flitted from one dream to the next, had decided to open a small clothing boutique. According to my mother, she'd poured her heart and soul into it. But her business partner, a man my mother described as slick and untrustworthy, had cleaned out their joint bank account and vanished, leaving Lacey with angry suppliers and a mountain of debt. The narrative was peppered with my mother's signature phrases designed to activate my long-dormant big sister guilt. "She was just so foolish, so trusting," she lamented. "She's your sister, Kira. Your little sister." I listened, my mind clearing. The military strategist in me automatically separating emotion from intelligence. The story had holes. It felt rehearsed. "How much trouble is she in, Mom?" "Oh, it's just awful. I don't even know." Her voice trailed off, and I heard a muffled exchange in the background. Then a new voice came on the line. A familiar, gravelly bark that made the muscles in my back tighten. It was my father. The handoff was seamless, a perfectly executed maneuver they had performed countless times before. My mother creates the emotional fog, and my father marches through it to give the orders. "Listen up," Frank said, his voice devoid of any warmth or concern. "I don't have time for nonsense. The kid's in a jam." He didn't say, "your sister." He said, "the kid," as if she were a troublesome piece of property. "She needs $15,000, now. You're the oldest, you've got that stable government job. Send the money, immediately." The number hit me like a physical blow. $15,000. It was an astronomical, almost absurd amount. It was more than I had in my entire savings account. "Dad, that's a lot of money," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't just produce that kind of cash overnight. I'd need some time to—" A harsh, ugly laugh cut me off. "Time?" he sneered, the contempt dripping from every syllable. "What do you need time for? To sit in your air-conditioned office on some island and push papers around? Your sister is dealing with real life out here, Kira. The real world, not your little make-believe army game." The attack was swift and brutal, hitting all the old targets. He belittled my career, dismissed my life, and minimized my success. But this time, it was worse. He wasn't just insulting me, he was trying to drag me back down into the role he had created for me, the useless, obligated janitor who owed them everything. "Don't start acting like you're too important for this family," he snarled. "You owe us. I raised you. I put a roof over your head. It's time to pay your debts." The old familiar feelings rose up in me like a tide of poison. Panic, guilt, a desperate, childish need to make it all stop. The 16-year-old girl at the kitchen table wanted to apologize, to promise she'd find a way, to do anything to end the lecture. But she wasn't the one holding the phone. Captain Kira Moore was, an officer in the United States Marine Corps who had managed multi-million-dollar supply chains and led Marines in a war zone. The woman Gunny Miller respected. The woman who had found her own family. I took one single, deliberate breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The chaos in my mind slowed. The panic receded. When I spoke, my voice was not my own. It was colder, calmer, and infinitely stronger. "I will review the situation," I said, the words precise and clipped as if I were giving a battlefield update. "I will call back after I analyze my options." I paused for a beat, leaving no room for argument. "Out." Then I hung up the phone, cutting off the sputtering rage I could hear building on the other end of the line. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone against the wall. I didn't cry. I just sat up in my bed, the darkness of my room in Okinawa feeling like a protective shield. The silence that followed the call was absolute, and in that silence, I understood. This hadn't been a desperate plea for help. It hadn't been a family crisis. It had been a calculated ambush, A coordinated assault designed to pull me back into their orbit of dysfunction. It was an invasion, and this time, I would not surrender. After I hung up on my father, an unnatural quiet descended. For 2 weeks, there were no more frantic calls, no pleading texts, no emails, nothing. An inexperienced soldier might mistake silence for peace, but I knew better. This was a tactical silence. It was the quiet before an artillery barrage, the unnerving calm before a coordinated attack. It was a punishment, designed to make me anxious, to make me doubt my own decision, to make me crawl back and beg for forgiveness. I tried to immerse myself in my work, focusing on deployment schedules and supply chain reports, but a low-grade hum of anxiety followed me everywhere. I felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't drop. It was thrown at my head with vicious, calculated aim. The attack came in the form of an email, not from my parents, but from my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister. Carol was a kind soul who had always treated me with a warmth that felt foreign in my family. Her emails were usually filled with news about her garden and pictures of her cats. This one was different. The subject line just said, "Thinking of you." My hands felt cold as I opened it. "Dearest Kira," she wrote, "I don't know if I should be telling you this, but my conscience won't let me rest. After the phone call about Lacey, Frank took matters into his own hands to solve the problem. Kira, he sold Grandpa's old tool chest, all of it. The hand planes, the chisels, everything. He told everyone he got a good price for it and that it was just collecting dust in the basement anyway. I am so sorry. I know how much those tools meant to you." I read the email 3 times, but the words refused to make sense. My grandfather, my mother's father, had been a carpenter. He was a quiet, gentle man who smelled of sawdust and patience. He was the only person in my childhood who ever looked at my strange, analytical mind and saw a gift, not a defect. He taught me how to read topographical maps, how to use a compass. He'd let me sit in his workshop for hours, watching him work miracles with wood. His tools were his legacy. They were beautiful, antique pieces of steel and wood, worn smooth by his hands. To my father, who preached the gospel of honest labor, these tools should have been sacred relics. But they weren't. To Frank, they were just another asset to be liquidated, another weapon to be used against me. This wasn't about raising money for Lacey. This was a punitive strike. He had targeted the one pure, sacred memory I had from my childhood, and he had desecrated it. He had taken my last connection to the one man who ever truly saw me, and he had sold it for cash. A feeling I couldn't name washed over me. It was colder than anger, heavier than grief. It was the feeling of something inside me finally breaking. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hand as I dialed their number. My mother answered, her voice immediately laced with a practiced, guilty tone. "Kira, honey." "He sold them," I said. It wasn't a question. "He had to, Kira," she whimpered, the pathetic excuse already prepared. "Lacey needed the money so badly. Your father—" "Put him on the phone," I said, my voice flat. I heard the phone being passed, and then Frank's belligerent voice filled my ear. There was no remorse, only defiance. "It's my house, my property. You weren't going to help, so don't you dare get an opinion now." He was actually blaming me. None of this would have happened if her own sister had just done the right thing in the first place. Then, for the first time, I heard a third voice. It was Lacey, crying. But her sobs were thick with accusation, not sorrow. "I'm sorry, Kira," she wailed. "But I really needed it. You're just so selfish." Selfish. The word echoed in the dead space between Okinawa and Pennsylvania. All my life, I had been the responsible one, the self-reliant one, the one who never asked for anything. And in their twisted reality, my refusal to be their personal ATM machine made me the selfish one. If you have ever been called selfish simply for setting a boundary to protect yourself, hit that like button right now and comment with the word "done" if you know what it feels like to finally say, enough is enough. A strange and terrifying clarity washed over me. The pain was gone. The anger was gone. All that was left was the cold, hard, and undeniable truth. They would never change. They would never see me. They would only ever see a resource to be used and an object to be blamed. I cut through their chorus of accusations, my voice so calm it didn't sound like my own. "I'll be home for Lacey's wedding," I stated. "I need to be there." A triumphant, ugly chuckle came from my father's end. "Good," he grunted. "About time you came to your senses." "No," I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. "I'm coming home to say goodbye." I paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment, sharp and final. "To all of you." I ended the call before any of them could respond. I didn't slam the phone down. I placed it gently on the nightstand. The battle had just been declared. Not with a shout of rage, but with a quiet, deadly promise. The invasion was over. The counter-offensive was about to begin. The flight from Okinawa to Pittsburgh was 17 hours of pressurized quiet. I didn't watch movies. I didn't listen to music. I spent the entire time transforming my grief and rage into something cold, hard, and useful. A plan. The emotional storm had passed. Now, the logistics officer was in command. The moment my feet were on American soil, I made my first call. Not to my family, but to the one man whose counsel I trusted completely. Gunny Miller, now retired and living a quiet life in North Carolina, picked up on the second ring. "Major Moore," he said, his voice as warm and steady as ever. "To what do I owe the honor?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries or emotional outbursts. I presented the situation to him the same way I would brief a commanding officer. I laid out the facts, the history of manipulation, the demand for money, the selling of my grandfather's tools, and my final declaration. I reported the facts, uncolored by tears or anger. He listened patiently, the silence on his end of the line a testament to his focus. When I finished, he didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He offered a directive. "Major," he said, and I noticed he'd promoted me from lieutenant in his memory, a sign of his enduring respect. "They've forgotten who you are. Sometimes a leader's job is to remind them. You do what you have to do. But you do it like a Marine. Smart, not loud." "Understood, Gunny," I said. "Godspeed, Major." His words weren't a comfort. They were an activation code. My mission was clear. Establish the truth. My method. Smart, not loud. That evening, in a sterile airport hotel room, I began my formal planning process. In the Corps, before any major operation, we use a framework called MET-TC. Mission, enemy, terrain, troops, time, and civilian considerations. For the first time, I applied it to my own family. Mission. To establish my value and sever the toxic ties on my own terms, not in a screaming match, but with undeniable, public truth. Enemy. My father, the primary aggressor. My mother and sister, the willing collaborators. Their tactics, guilt, gaslighting, and the weaponization of my sense of duty. Terrain. The wedding reception at Cary Blast Furnaces. A neutral site, but filled with their allies. A high-pressure, emotionally charged environment. Troops. I was a force of one. My only potential asset was an unknown variable, the groom's father. This led me to the intelligence-gathering phase of my operation. I opened my laptop and searched for General Mark Peterson, the groom's father. My sister was marrying into a military family, a detail my father had conveniently ignored. The search results were extensive. General Peterson was a decorated 2-star Army general, a West Point graduate, a man with a sterling reputation. I spent hours reading articles about him, watching his speeches on YouTube. He spoke about integrity, about leading from the front, about how respect is the bedrock of the military. I read a quote from a speech he gave at a Memorial Day service. "We wear this uniform not to command fear, but to earn respect. And that respect is owed to every single person who takes the oath, regardless of rank or job." I felt a spark of recognition. He wasn't a blustering tyrant like my father tried to be. He was a man who believed in the same system of merit and honor that had saved me. He believed in the world where I belonged. He was no longer an unknown variable. He was now a key strategic asset. The next evening was the rehearsal dinner, held at a steakhouse downtown. This was my opportunity to conduct reconnaissance and prepare the battlefield. I saw General Peterson across the room, talking with his wife. He was exactly as he appeared in his photos, tall, distinguished, with an air of quiet authority. I waited for a lull in the conversation, took a steadying breath, and approached. I did not approach him as a victim seeking aid. I approached him as a fellow officer. "General Peterson, sir," I said, my voice clear and steady. He turned, his eyes sharp and intelligent. "Ma'am," he replied, giving me a respectful nod. "Major Kira Moore, Marine Corps," I said, introducing myself. "I'm Lacey's sister. It's an honor to meet you, sir." "The honor is mine, Major. Your sister is a lovely young woman. My son is a lucky man." "Thank you, sir," I replied. "Sir, if I may have a moment, I wanted to provide you with some context about my family so that you're not caught by surprise tomorrow." His expression shifted slightly, a flicker of professional curiosity. He gave a slight nod. "Go on." "My father is a man who values a certain kind of work," I explained, keeping my tone neutral and factual. "My career in military logistics is difficult for him to comprehend. He has a nickname for me. He calls me the glorified janitor." I let the ugly words hang in the air for a moment. "In our world, sir, respect is absolute. It's ingrained in everything we do. In my family, it's a more relative concept. I just thought you should be aware of the terrain." He studied my face for a long moment, his eyes seeing more than I was saying. He saw the discipline, the control. He recognized a fellow professional. "Understood, Major," he said finally. "Thank you for the briefing." With a nod, I excused myself. The seed had been planted. I hadn't asked him for anything. I had simply provided intelligence to a senior officer. What he did with it was his command decision. Back in my hotel room that night, I faced my final tactical choice: my uniform. My full dress blues were hanging in a garment bag, the crimson blood stripe on the trousers crisp, the brass buttons polished to a mirror shine. To wear it would be a statement of power, an act of defiance. But Gunny's words came back to me. Smart, not loud. Wearing my uniform would be loud. It would be an escalation. It would make me the aggressor in their eyes. My father would use it as proof of my arrogance. No, my power didn't come from the uniform. It came from the truth. I turned to my suitcase and pulled out a simple, dark navy blue dress. It was modest, elegant, and completely unremarkable. I would walk into that wedding not as a major, but as Kira Moore, a daughter and a sister. I would be the civilian. I would let them be the ones in uniform, the uniforms of their own prejudice, their own cruelty, their own lies. My weapon wouldn't be the eagle, globe, and anchor on my collar. My weapon would be their own actions, brought into the light for everyone to see. I arrived at the wedding reception alone. Dressed in my simple navy dress, I was intentionally unremarkable, a ghost slipping into the festivities unnoticed. I found my assigned table at the back of the reception tent, a strategic outpost from which I could observe the entire battlefield. My family was exactly where I knew they would be, at the center of everything, a loud laughing vortex of attention. They moved with an unnerving ease, my father clapping men on the back, my mother fussing over Lacey's dress. Watching them, you would never know that just days before, they had committed an act of profound betrayal. They performed their roles with a cheerful, practiced denial that was colder and harder than the steel furnaces looming outside. I didn't have to wait long. The operation commenced exactly as I had predicted. Frank couldn't resist an audience. He saw me sitting alone, saw his relatives gathered at the table next to mine, and saw his opportunity. He approached with that familiar, swaggering gait, the walk of a man who owned the world and everyone in it. He leaned over, a casual, menacing presence, and delivered his prepared remarks. "That one's just a glorified janitor," he announced to the table, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Who even invited her?" This time, I didn't just hear the attack. I watched it detonate. I saw the cruel, satisfied smirk on my father's face as his words landed. I saw my mother's gaze flicker away, her silence a perfect act of complicity. I saw my sister Lacey, the beautiful bride, give a small, uncomfortable smile, and turned to her new husband, a silent dismissal. And I heard the familiar chorus of laughter from my aunts and cousins, the sound that had haunted my childhood. It was all happening again, just as it always had. But this time, there was a new element on the battlefield. This time, they had a witness. And then, it happened. From the head table, General Mark Peterson stood up. It was not a dramatic leap to his feet. It was a slow, deliberate, and powerful movement that seemed to pull all the sound and energy in the room towards him. The laughter died in people's throats. Conversations sputtered and stopped. Forks and knives froze halfway to their mouths. The entire chaotic reception hall fell into a sudden, shocked silence. The only sound was the faint clinking of ice cubes in a glass. General Peterson was in his dress uniform, a constellation of ribbons and medals on his chest. He turned his body to face me, across the expanse of the room, and then he did something that shattered my father's world. He raised his right hand to the brim of his cap and executed a perfect, textbook military salute. His arm was ramrod straight, his fingers aligned, his gaze locked directly on me. In the civilian world, it might look like a simple greeting. But in our world, a salute is a profound act. It is not a gesture between people. It is a gesture of respect for the rank, the responsibility, and the sacrifice that a person represents. Junior personnel salute senior officers, and here a two-star general was saluting a major. It was a public, unequivocal declaration of respect that defied every rule my father had ever lived by. The silence in the room stretched, becoming thick and heavy. Then the general's voice, a calm and commanding baritone honed by decades of leadership, cut through the quiet. He was not speaking to me. He was speaking to my father, but he never took his eyes off me. "Sir," he said, the word sir used with a formal, cutting courtesy. "With all due respect." He paused, letting the weight of the phrase settle into the room. "She outranks every last one of us in here." The statement was not an opinion. It was not an insult. It was a fact delivered with the force of a cannon shot fired directly into the flimsy foundation of my father's entire belief system. I watched my father's face. For the first time in my life, I saw him completely undone. The smugness vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed, utter confusion. His world, a simple place where he was the king, where men worked with their hands and women were either pretty or useful, had just been turned upside down. This man, this general, a man Frank was biologically incapable of disrespecting, had just used the very language of strength and hierarchy that my father worshipped to declare him wrong. Utterly, fundamentally wrong. The system itself had turned against him. His brain couldn't compute it. His face went pale, a pasty, sickly gray. A sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at me, truly, looked at me, as if for the first time, and in his eyes I saw not hatred, but the terrifying blankness of a man whose reality has just been vaporized. Then, his knees buckled. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical fall. It was a slow, clumsy collapse. His body just seemed to lose its structural integrity. He listed to one side, his big, powerful hands grasping at the back of a chair, missing it completely. He went down in a heap, landing on the floor with a heavy, sickening thud. People gasped. My mother screamed his name. But I knew what I had just witnessed. It wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't a stroke. It was the collapse of a worldview. It was the sound of decades of arrogant, willful ignorance shattering into a million pieces on a cold, concrete floor. The glorified janitor had just brought the whole damn cathedral crashing down. The aftermath of my father's collapse was a strange, surreal silence. The paramedics came, checked him out, and concluded it was likely a vasovagal syncope, a simple faint caused by a sudden emotional shock. They helped him to a small private office off the main hall to rest, and the wedding reception tried its best to pretend nothing had happened. The music started up again, a little too loud, a little too cheerful. But the atmosphere was irrevocably changed. The air was thick with a new kind of awareness. People avoided my gaze, not with the contempt of before, but with a kind of awkward, nervous respect. The truth, once detonated, leaves radioactive fallout. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, needing a moment to process the sudden, violent end to a war I'd been fighting my whole life. The feeling wasn't the triumphant elation I might have expected. It was a hollow, echoing quiet. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me and turned to see General Peterson approaching. He stopped a few feet away, giving me my space. He didn't mention my father. He didn't offer apologies or explanations. He just looked at me with the clear, steady gaze of a commander. "Major," he said, his voice calm and even. "Sometimes the truth needs an armed escort. Thank you for allowing me to provide it." I was stunned. He wasn't treating me like a damsel in distress he had just rescued. He was speaking to me as a peer, an ally in a successful operation. His words were a confirmation far more profound than the salute. He was acknowledging my strategy, my courage. He was telling me that he hadn't just acted for me, he had acted with me. "Thank you, General," I managed to say, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Your support was decisive." He gave a single sharp nod and walked back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The victory was real, but the aftermath was messy. And it was coming for me. My mother found me first. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, her face a mask of weary accusation. "Look what you've done," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your father is humiliated. Couldn't you have just let it go? For one day? Why do you always have to make things so difficult?" I looked at my mother, the woman whose lifelong mission was to maintain peace at any cost, and for the first time, I felt no anger, only a deep, bottomless sorrow. "I did let it go, Mom," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I let it go for 29 years. Your peace was built on my silence. The price just got too high." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, unable to compute a reality where her needs weren't the center of the universe. She turned and fled before I could say anything else. Next came Lacey, a vision of white lace and simmering resentment. Her perfect wedding day had been tarnished. "You ruined my wedding," she hissed, her voice low and furious. "You just had to make it all about you, didn't you? Today was supposed to be my day." "No, Lacey," I replied, my voice just as quiet but carrying the weight of decades. "Dad did this. He brought his war to your wedding, and you, and Mom, you've always let him." The truth of the words hung between us, stark and undeniable. She had no answer. She just glared at me, turned, and retreated back to the safety of her party. A few hours later, as the reception was winding down, one of my cousins told me my father wanted to see me. I found him in the small office, sitting on a folding chair, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen him. He didn't look at me when I entered. He just stared at his own hands, the thick, calloused hands of a man who built things with brick and mortar. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice raspy. "All I know is hammers and concrete." He finally looked up, and I was shocked to see his eyes were wet with tears. "That man. The general. They all call you ma'am." I didn't hear it before." He shook his head, a look of genuine, pathetic confusion on his face. "That's my fault." It wasn't an apology, not really. It was a confession of his own blindness. It didn't erase the years of pain, the deliberate cruelty, the theft of my grandfather's memory. But it was a crack. The first tiny fracture in the fortress of his pride. It was more than I ever thought I would get. I didn't rush to hug him. I didn't say, "It's okay." The damage was too deep for a simple bandage. I just stood there and absorbed his broken admission. "I know, Dad," I said quietly. I turned to leave, but stopped at the door. I had one final thing to say, one final boundary to draw. I looked back at him, making sure he was looking at me. "I will always be your daughter," I said, my voice clear and without malice. "But I am done being your janitor. From now on, I require respect." I let that sink in. "If you can't give me that, then I'm going to need distance." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of new terms, a peace treaty offered after a long and painful war. As I walked out of that room, leaving him alone with the wreckage of his worldview, the words of the Serenity Prayer echoed in my mind. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I couldn't change my father. I couldn't undo the past. The courage to change the things I can. But I could change the rules of engagement. I could change what I was willing to accept, and the wisdom to know the difference. I was finally wise enough to know the difference. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about forgetting what they did. It was about releasing myself from the burden of their judgment. My war wasn't over. The next phase, the long, quiet work of healing, was just beginning. 3 years after my sister's wedding, the world looked different. Or perhaps it was just that I was looking at it with different eyes. I'd been promoted again, and my career had taken me to a place I'd once only read about, the Pentagon. The work was demanding, a complex world of global logistics and strategic planning that challenged me every single day. It was exactly where I belonged. The distance I had demanded from my family had settled into a new, quiet reality. It wasn't the warm, easy relationship I saw in other families, but it was peaceful. The war was over. We had a truce, built on the fragile foundation of respect I had laid down that day. My father, in his own clumsy way, tried to bridge the gap. Every few weeks, a manila envelope would arrive at my DC apartment. Inside, I'd find a newspaper article he had clipped, usually something from the Wall Street Journal about military supply chains or defense budgets. There was never a note, but I understood the gesture. It was his way of trying to learn my language, to understand the world he had once so viciously mocked. It was his form of an apology, the only kind he knew how to give. Lacey and I found our own tentative peace after she had her first child, a little boy named Sam. When I held my nephew for the first time, looking at his tiny, perfect hands, the old resentments seemed to fade. In the shared, universal experience of loving a child, we found a small patch of common ground. The healing was slow, imperfect, and incomplete. But it was happening. My life, however, was no longer defined by them. It was defined by what I chose to build. On weekends, I shed my identity as Major Kira Moore. I became just Kira, a big sister in the Big Brothers Big Sisters of America program. My little sister was a 14-year-old girl named Maya. She was whip-smart, fiercely independent, and had a habit of taking apart every electronic device she could get her hands on just to see how it worked. In her curious, analytical eyes, I saw a reflection of the little girl I used to be, the one who covered her walls in weather charts. My job wasn't just to help her with her algebra homework or take her to museums, though we did plenty of that. My real mission was to be the person I'd needed when I was her age. It was to look at her intense curiosity not as an odd hobby, but as a superpower. When she successfully rewired a broken lamp, I didn't just tell her she was clever. I told her she was a problem solver, an engineer in the making. I was determined to ensure that she would never have to wait until she was 29 to hear that her unique way of seeing the world was a strength, not a flaw. I was passing the torch, ensuring the fire my family tried to extinguish in me would burn brightly in someone else. One Tuesday afternoon, a heavy cube-shaped package arrived at my door. It was postmarked from Pittsburgh. My heart did a familiar, cautious dip, but the return address was my Aunt Carol's. I cut the packing tape and lifted the flaps. Inside, nestled in a bed of old towels, was the rich, dark wood of my grandfather's tool chest. On top lay a handwritten letter from my aunt. Kira, it read. It took me a while, but I tracked down the man Frank sold these to. He was a collector. I told him the story, your story. I convinced him to sell them back to me. I could picture her saying the words, her voice full of gentle determination. I think these belong with the person who knows their real value. Love, Carol. I reached into the box and lifted out his favorite handplane. The steel was cool and heavy, the wooden handle worn to a silky, perfect patina from the grip of his hand. I could almost smell the faint, sweet scent of cedar shavings and workshop dust. I ran my thumb over the smooth wood and felt the circle of my life finally close. The legacy that had been stolen from me had found its way home. The story ends here, on a Saturday afternoon, on the floor of my sunny living room. Maya and I are on our hands and knees, surrounded by a pile of popsicle sticks, a bottle of wood glue, and a set of architectural plans I'd helped her draft. We are building a model of a truss bridge. She carefully glues a final stick into place, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looks up at me, her eyes bright with a question that has nothing to do with bridges. "Kira," she asks, "is it hard, being a major?" I look at her, this brilliant, wonderful girl, and I feel a wave of profound love and clarity. I smile. "The hard part isn't being a major, Maya," I say softly. "The hard part is learning to believe you deserve your place at the table, no matter what anyone else says. Success isn't about other people finally seeing you. It's about you finally seeing your own value." I reach out and gently tap the top of the small, sturdy bridge she just built, and then using it to build something solid. I look down at the little bridge, a tangible thing created from a plan, from intellect, from patience and precision. My father had been right about one thing. The world is built by builders. He just never understood that some of the strongest things are built not with bricks and mortar, but with a quiet, unbreakable resolve. I had finally become a builder, in my own way. And the foundation I stood on was finally my own. And so that's where my story ends, or rather, where my new life truly began. My foundation is now built on respect, purpose, and the family I chose. Now, I want to hear about yours. In the comments below, I want you to tell me about just one brick you have laid for your own foundation. It could be setting a boundary, learning a new skill, or forgiving yourself. This channel is a place for stories like these, stories about finding strength when we feel invisible. If my journey resonated with you, please subscribe and hit the like button. It helps these stories reach others who might need to hear that they are not alone, and that they too can become the builder of their own life.